This is Confusion Factor.
Hello, my name is Justin Oldham, and I am the author of How to Write Conspiracy Fiction. And for the next 20 minutes, I'd like to tell you about conspiracy fiction, what it is, where it came from, and why it's an emerging story form in today's literary world. Conspiracy fiction is directly related to espionage fiction, and more specifically, this art form traces its lineage directly from post-World War II espionage fiction that really comes from an era in which people started to distrust government, and the whole thing begins with authors like Jean le Carré and even Robert Ludlum, who penned characters who had reasons to mistrust their own spy organizations. Check, check. Now that bit of literary distrust begins innocently enough, but it turns out to be quite popular with readers in the 50s and 60s. Now anybody who's a film buff will happen to know that in that same period, in the world of Hollywood, we see the rise of the anti-hero. So, the spy who mistrusts his own organization gradually becomes parlayed into the spy who mistrusts his own government. And as this becomes more pervasive in books and movies, it becomes the cultural norm as we move into the 1970s. Now, this little bit of literary history is not as well known as you would think it might be, because the average American, while they enjoy their books and their movies, they don't think about them in the context of what goes on in the real world. But they do tend to think in real world terms. And for most people who are alive today, if you ask them, they will say that the mistrust of government began with the death of John F. Kennedy. Conspiracy theorists today mark the death of JFK as being the start of the conspiracy era. Now, that might be true from a purely mercenary or commercial perspective, but as I've just demonstrated, it's not true from the literary perspective. Now, corrupt politicians and double-dealing bureaucrats have been common fixtures in various forms of fiction for more than 1,000 years. But what marks this as being a big deal in the post-World War II period is that the mistrust of the spy agency, which eventually becomes the mistrust of the government because of its secret agenda, is more of an integral part of the storyline. If you were to take out your magic wand and erase it from the storyline, then the entire book falls apart. That's not really true of classical literature. If you were to go back and remove it from, let's just take one example, any of the tales of the Three Musketeers, you would still have court intrigues, you would still have romance, you would still have enough there to work with so that those corrupt officials don't necessarily matter so much to the continuation of the art form. But in the post-World War II period, the government and the secret agenda becomes absolutely vital to that story method. Now, this is just me talking to you without a script, so take what I say with a grain of salt. I read this stuff for decades. I was fascinated by the very concept of conspiracy fiction, and I carried an idea for a novel around in my head for many years before I actually had a chance to write it. Now, just to give you a handle on this stuff, there's a couple of movies I'd like to recommend, which are also based on books. So if you want to compare the books and the movies, these things are not that hard to find. You want to look for a film called The Chairman. You also want to look for another movie called 7 Days in May. Both of these are based off of books, which you should be able to find in your local libraries. Now, if you can't find them in your local libraries, then they're a breeze to get off of your favorite internet website. You can get them for Kindle or for the Nook, whatever your favorite e-reader is. They're not hard to find. Now, if you want something a bit more contemporary, something from the 1970s, look for 3 Days of the Condor. Now, if that's not enough movie watching for you, I'd like you to round out that selection by finding both versions of The Manchurian Candidate, both the original and the remake, because the sum total of all that movie watching, especially if you watch them in chronological order based on the years that they were released, you'll be able to see the transition from Cold War spy stuff to government-related fear of secret agenda thing. Now, there's one very important thing to understand about conspiracy fiction as we're looking at this chronology. The actual use of the word conspiracy and the term conspiracy fiction really doesn't come into vogue until the post 9/11 world. I first encountered the term in the mid 1990s. I'd known about it in the 1980s as an academic concept, but I didn't see it anywhere in the mainstream media until the 1990s. I do recognize that a podcast like this has time capsule value, and somebody 50, 60, 100 years from now might have a chance to listen to this. So I would like to point out that as we sit here now in 2013, which is when I make this recording, that it's still politically incorrect to use the term conspiracy fiction. If you apply that label to your work, it'll still get you slapped around by critics because they think that it's somehow dirty, wrong, or subversive, even though it really is academically correct. Now, speaking of things that are dirty, wrong, and subversive, they want me to pause for a quick commercial break, so I'll pick up this conversation when we come back on the other side.
This program is brought to you by ShadowFusionBooks.com.
Now, there is a reason why the term conspiracy fiction has always been politically incorrect. In the aftermath of World War II, Americans were far more nationalistic than they are today. They were far and away more proud of their Americanness than they are today. There was no hyphenation of your American status like there is today, and so it was really just not cool to say anything bad about your government or your spy agencies in general. Because, hey, after all, they're defending your freedom, they're protecting your way of life, and any author who had the nerve to suggest that a spy agency was acting perhaps a little bit not kosher, that was really, that was outside the bounds of acceptability in its day. And hey, authors will sometimes push the limits of acceptability in an effort to really not just drive their art form to the next level, but also to set themselves apart from everybody else. So these are just some of the reasons why some of the authors at that point in time were dabbling in the concepts of disloyalty. There also happened to be another side to this that was far less glamorous and actually far less known to the average person who went down to their corner store and bought a book and took it home to read it. And that boils down to the actual source of the material. Now, anybody who actually writes whether they are academic or whether they're commercial in motive, understands that you write what you know. And in the post-Cold War period, there were a lot of people writing spy fiction who had some involvement in espionage during World War II. I mean, Ian Fleming, who is the very famous creator of the very, very famous James Bond, he was involved in British espionage during the Second World War. So in effect, he was really writing about what he knew, and okay, some of the backbiting politics that he saw going on behind closed doors, yeah, that influenced his writing. Other people did very much the same things. You can argue that some authors were using their poisoned pen to settle old scores, and other authors were simply pushing the artistic frontiers of their genre. But the simple fact of the matter is that they were putting that stuff out there, and people read it, and they liked it because it seemed gritty and real. And when they looked at what was going on in the 50s and the 60s, what they saw happening around them didn't really jive with what they saw in the newspapers or saw on the television or even heard on the radio. So when the media says one thing and something else is going on in the real world, yeah, that does kind of plant the seed of mistrust. Now, the further we get from the Second World War, transitioning from the 1970s into the 80s, a lot of the don't trust government stuff that comes out in books and movies gets away from the spy and starts to center on the politicians, and so you start to see more stuff about civil servants who are whistleblowers or do-gooder politicians who are trying to stop corruption. And you start seeing other things in the books and movies which are softer. They're kinder versions of the Cold War concepts. They are less political in terms of East versus West, in terms of democracy versus communism, and they get to be more domestic. That's one of the reasons why a lot of the movies that you saw in the 1980s focused on corruption here at home and the idea of preventing military coups here at home or preventing a president from seeking an unconstitutional third term here at home. Oh, that might seem a little strange given what was going on at that point in time, Cold War, threat of nuclear annihilation and all that, but by the 1980s, my fellow Americans were not nearly so afraid of the Soviet Union as they used to be. All of a sudden now, we had cell phones and cable TVs, and we had more credit card applications in our mailboxes than we knew what to do with, and all that stuff made us fat and happy. So instead of looking at overseas threats, we started paying attention to threats closer to home, and the literature changed to reflect that. Now, there were a lot of people who presaged the death of the spy novel when the Berlin Wall comes down in 1989. And some people even went so far as to say that the idea of mistrust in government would also be dead by the end of the century. Now, it'll come as no surprise to you that I, as a student of both history and politics, disagreed with that assessment. Although I will make one small admission here and now, I began working on my first conspiracy fiction novel in late 1998, and I did feel just a tad bit alone and isolated because I was surrounded by literary experts who were presaging the death of what I was proceeding to write. There would be no market for my work, and I would be wasting my time, and well, honestly, I just blocked all that stuff out and kept going. Because as a student of politics and as a student of history, I really did disagree. Now, here's why. Each and every single decade of peace and prosperity that a society continues to enjoy causes the people in that society to be just a little bit more selfish. We want to know what else we can have, what more good stuff is out there for us. And as we're interested in more and more stuff for us, we come to trust our governments less and less because our governments keep telling us, hey, we can do more stuff for you because you deserve it. Oh, by the way, we got to pay for all this stuff somehow, so you don't mind if we raise your taxes, do you? So, hey, there's a basis for this mistrust, which makes it real easy for any creative mind to pick it up, play with it, and just start putting words to it. And you can do this in any genre: Western, science fiction, romance, or, dare I say, espionage. Perhaps put a little twist on it, and lo and behold, what do you have? You've got conspiracy fiction. So if you take the long view on this, it's not hard to see how, from the end of World War II all the way up until the mid to late 1990s, how these kind of fictional characters, how this type of literature gets a bad rap. But then a funny thing begins to happen in the late 1990s that a lot of people just haven't paid attention to. Now, in the 1990s, you've got a number of big deal events, which include the bombing of the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, the commercialization of the UFO phenomenon in 1993. There's the first bombing of the World Trade Center, and just so on and so forth. I don't want to bother anybody with a history lesson here. But there's a number of things that go on at this point in time that the media sensationalizes, and they grab the C word and they start using conspiracy this and conspiracy that. And the first thing they do is they vilify the term conspiracy theorist, and then they make fun of it, and then they glamorize it. And lo and behold, they will slowly over time legitimize it, so that by the time September 11, 2001 rolls around, what you think of today as the entire conspiracy theory cottage industry, it exists out in the open without fear of reprisal from anyone. The term conspiracy fiction is not in widespread use. You don't see it used very much in the mainstream media at all unless they choose to use it in a mocking tone. But otherwise, you'll find it in the halls of academia, and you will occasionally find people that follow the art form seriously. Things have evolved that much. It's still on its way towards maturation. I like to think that it could be a more mainstream art form in another 20 or 30 years. There aren't exactly what you'd call rules attached to it yet, but by mid-century there probably will be, because everything that's considered subversive about fiction today that causes people to question authority will be no big deal eventually, because some of the prejudices that motivate writers today will not exist in 30 or 40 years, and if they do, they'll seem quaint. So this, in very broad terms, is the history of conspiracy fiction. The political science nerd in me loves this stuff to pieces because it gives me the opportunity to write what I know about government and history. I can tap my experience as a former civil servant, and I can draw on my education as a historian, and I can plumb the depths of the human condition just like any other author would. I can explore the outcomes of moral and ethical dilemmas in the context of government, and I can ask all of the same what-ifs that today's politically correct leaders would think are just a little bit too ticklish. I'm fortunate. I live in a society where writing this kind of thing does not earn me a bullet. So I have the luxury of being able to do something like this out in the light of day where everybody can see it. I can make a podcast like this where anybody who wants to click on it can hear it. But there are some people who live under the regime of some governments where a conversation like what you have just listened to is against the law. The nice men in the black leather trench coats would come and find you just for listening to something like this. So you can imagine what sort of trouble you might get into if you wanted to write your own conspiracy fiction novel under those conditions. Now, having said all this, I'd like to sign off by reminding you that the weight of history is on your side. The pen is mightier than the sword, and you should act accordingly.
You've been listening to The Fusion Factor, brought to you by Shadow Fusion Books. Find us online at shadowfusionbooks.com.